Hello, once again. It's good to see all of you this morning. Appreciate you being here. And before I forget, I'll go ahead and say a word of thanks for all of those that helped out yesterday. And Polson being there all morning, then on into the afternoon. Did you guys stay longer than the Mormons?
Oh,
Good
yeah.
job. Nice work. But thank you all for being there and taking the time out to be involved in the community, allowing them to see us, talk to us, and trying to generate conversation and communication with them. I had one lady yesterday. She called me shortly after I left you guys to go to the Republican thing. She was one of the ones that we had asked about the challenge and that
The older lady?
No, it was actually the one that came to the tent.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. And she called and she said that she had already read the tract, or one of the tracts that we gave her, in particular the one about faith, works, and grace. Mm-hmm. And she said she read through it and that she agreed with what we were saying in the tract. And I said, well, I'm happy to hear that, but I'm a bit surprised because we're the only ones that will teach that, in fact, if you're going to find God's salvation, there is faith, there is grace, but there's works involved. And everybody else around us, all the other churches, they're not going to teach you that there is work included in your responsibility so as to gain or to get salvation. And so we talked a little bit about that, and then she needed some more clarification about what specifically her $200 challenge was. And so I reminded her it was about her testimony about her salvation and trying to find that in the New Testament. So already having some effect that people taking the information, they're reading it. So thank you for your time and doing that, and we'll see where it goes. Give yourself a pat on the back. All right, John 10, verse 11. We are in this section of Jesus' communication with his parable to where we might read through this and consider, well, he's not really adding anything to his discussion, but in reality he is. He adds on an extra layer in this contrast that we are studying about between the shepherds that they had at this time, being the priests, Levites, priests, the Pharisees, Sadducees, and the scribes, to his leadership, which is the true leadership that they are needing at that time, the kind of leadership they should have been having, to where, okay, here are these shepherds, but I'm the true shepherd and the real shepherd that you're needing to follow. But then he takes it to the next level in illustration and in this parable by stating that he's not simply a shepherd or the shepherd, but he's the good shepherd. And he's going to give an explanation as to why it is that he is qualified to take on such a title and why these others are not. Now, another element that we're needing to add into this, and that we're going to take some time to discuss, is that we're not needing to lose sight of what's being talked about in this text by what our denominational friends and those in positions of false doctrine will try to teach from this section. So let me just go ahead and ask, because we've done it in the past with different chapters and talking about how we commonly think about them, what's the subject matter, and how it's used. So with what we're about to get into in John 10, verse 11, and specifically through 27 through 29, what do we commonly picture, view those, or know these verses as?
Is
Is it once saved, always saved?
Okay. Calvinism, perseverance of the saints. That our denominational friends will go to those verses and try to pluck them out and use them as a proof text for, well, once you believe God and once you believe in Christ and put your faith in Him, you can never fall away. And as we've mentioned in our Matthew study, in our Corinthian study, when that happens, what do we then have the tendency of doing to these passages?
Skipping over them?
Well, not skipping over. Well, that's part of it, yeah. For some of our brethren, they have the tendency of just shying away from it.
But then it goes to the grace and mercy part to where you start teaching the opposite of it.
Okay. That we end up just start looking at this from the standpoint of, well, how can we answer Calvinism with this? And then we completely miss what's actually being presented, what is being taught. Now, I'm not saying that we shouldn't use these passages in that framework. But it's just the emphasis of that's not what these verses are there for. These verses are being used, or these these words are being used in a specific context dealing with specific subject matter that it needs to be kept in. And though individuals may come in and try to manipulate and pervert different sections of the scripture, does not then mean that we need to go chasing after that and miss out what is actually there for us. And then end up, as Reese mentioned, skipping over it because we're afraid of what possible implications may be because of how it sounds.
Well, in the context of Jesus is still standing there with the Jews, and he is qualifying himself as the good shepherd because he's following what God has said. They are the hireling. The sheep are not following them, or they're leading them astray. And then he also goes on to open it up for the world. And it's not just for the Jews. So.
I mean, absolutely. But then it comes into the element of, well, how, in dealing with it in its context, how would we answer the Calvinist? And instead of allowing this to stay in its context, we can actually end up bringing ourselves into a position where we end up explaining it in such a way that we end up doing some damage to what the text teaches, instead of just allowing it to say what it says. But that's just putting your antennas up there for what we're going to be dealing with, and to get us honed back into the context. And in remembering the context, Christ has laid out this parable in establishing himself as the true shepherd, entering through the door, not through any other means like the Pharisees and Sadducees have done. And that being through the door of the Old Testament, those prophecies laying out, being fulfilled before their very eyes, and then even having the imagery of the porter opening the door for him so as to grant him access. And who's the porter?
John the Baptist.
Okay, John the Immerser, John the Baptist. So then that brings us to verse 11, where we have this shift in analogy. I am the good shepherd. The good shepherd giveth his life for the sheep. There's the distinction. The separation of why he gets to take on this title of good shepherd. And that being that he is going to lay down his life for the sheep. And then the contrast to what they have at that time. But he that is an hireling, and not the shepherd, whose own the sheep are not, seeth the wolf coming, leaveth the sheep, and fleeth, and the wolf catcheth them, and scattereth the sheep. The hireling fleeth because he is an hireling, and careth not for the sheep. Now, what also is difficult about this passage, or this section, is because when we come to this context and the use of the word hireling, is the word hireling a negative word? Is it a negative thing to be a hireling? Okay, I'm seeing some no's. Why not?
I heard your mouth open.
Okay, sorry, Reese. Jesus is requiring us to do work. God expected the Jews to give the message not just for them, but for the whole world, that the world might be saved through them. So they were the hireling.
Yeah. I mean, the word hireling just means a paid worker, a paid employee. And isn't that one of the illustrations, one of the parables that Jesus uses about how the kingdom is pictured? And that you have a landowner, and what does he do?
Hires people.
He went out a certain part of the day and hired workers. And then he went out again at another time of day, hired more workers. Well, that's a hireling. So when we're thinking about this from that standpoint and making sure that though this word is being used in this context and that yes, this is a negative context, when we're considering the work of the hireling and that it just simply being a paid worker, a servant, what's being presented here, we need to take to heart, in that just as Jamie mentioned, that okay, while Jesus is saying this to this Jewish audience, and he has the Pharisees and everybody else in mind, you then have to take into consideration, well, the apostles are there listening to this too. And that when Jesus leaves, what are they going to be put in the position of doing? Just as Jamie said, they're going to be put in the position of ministering to, serving over, and watching over, delegating to God's people. The sheep are not yours. They belong to somebody else. And that presents at least two dangers in my mind, though I'm certain that there's more. One of those being what's pictured here, and that, well, okay, these aren't my sheep, so I'm not going to lay down my life for them. I'm not going to put myself in danger so as to try to protect them. When they see the danger coming, they take off and run. Well, what's being said here about this group could happen today. What about elders, hirelings, that do not take on the full responsibility of their work, and that is to oversee, to watch over, to look over, and feed the flock? Okay, hey, these aren't mine. I'm not going to take on any responsibility that's going to come back to make me look bad or have me viewed in a negative light. Just let them go. Let them be devoured and scattered across the hills. That's one danger that's presented, but then what's another danger that Jesus ends up presenting with some of his other parables about? I'm trying not to give it away, but so when Jesus gives the parable of the king with his vineyard, and he let it out to hired servants,
They took it over and killed the son.
They took it over as though it were their own. And they started trying to run it and delegate it as they saw fit. And then when the king tries to rein it back in and take it back under his own authority, they beat the servants, sent them back, and then when the son is finally sent, they killed the son and they try to gain upon his own inheritance. And so when we're coming to this, and with it being used in this form and in this fashion, we're not needing to let our minds run away with ourselves and that, okay, yeah, this is just a naturally terrible person. No, that's not the situation here. The Levites and the priests, they were put in position under the Old Testament to watch over and to guard over God's people. And it's a difficult spot to be in. Because with the recognition of, okay, yes, I have authority being given to me, but I have authority over something that's not mine. And because it's not mine, I treat it differently. I mean, we see this all the time when it comes to, I'm sure you guys have certain people that you know that you wouldn't let borrow tools. And the reason is because they have the tendency
To not give back your laser level.
Right. They have the tendency of not respecting what isn't theirs. Well, it's not mine, and then they just beat it up, knock it around, and they bring it back to you, and it's worthless. And that what's being discussed here in a warning to this Old Testament system is still a warning for the New Testament system. With the apostles, they're going to sit on 12 thrones judging over Israel. Okay, you're a hireling. You're being put in possession of something that's not yours. Do not abuse it, and do not leave it defenseless.
Matthew 5:3, I mean, it requires an awful lot of that for them to really do justice to the position. And
right.
We know as we're going along and following them that they're not there until after he ascends and everything comes to their remembrance of what happens. And
even after that, you have different ones that have to be called back into line. Peter, primarily because we have recorded about him. But I'm sure the other apostles had their own issues and dealing with different points of this element. But so again, as we're thinking about this, it's not just about the sheep. We have just as much being presented about leadership as we do about those that are going to follow. And that this finds its application not only in the church, but when it comes to running a home in a biblical fashion, relationship of marriage, relationship of parents, being out in the workforce, being a good worker. You have to have good followers, but you have to have good leaders. Yeah.
Basically, just stole my thunder.
Okay.
I was going to go to the work side of it. You get McDonald's workers, to where most of the people don't care about their job. It's a corporation. Leadership is horrible.
Yeah.
So they don't care about who they're serving. You know, 6 times out of 10, your burger's wrong or something's wrong out of what you've ordered, and then you're in a bad environment, workforce. But then you go from that to working for someone like I work for a small electrical company, and I'm the only employee, so you're taking on the name of the company when you're going. And guys have tried to get me to do things that are shady, and it's like, I can't do that because it's going to fall back on my boss's name.
Right.
And I can't do that because I'm carrying the name of his company, so his reputation. So I'm just thinking, the word that was coming to my mind was ambassador,
Yeah.
because you're taking on the name of what you're going for.
Mhm.
And as long as you can keep that in your mind, that I'm still, as you're explaining, taking on the name that I'm still underneath something. Yeah, I might be in charge of what's underneath me, but there's still someone that's above me, and I'm taking his name with me everywhere I go.
Mhm.
And that's where, when you're baptized, you're taking on the name of Christ.
Yeah.
So that's what was just rolling through my brain.
And then it's also Matthew 7:12 about the golden rule. You don't forget about that just because you are in a position of authority or leadership. Do unto others, you'd have them do unto you. Okay, I have authority. Well, there's somebody in authority over me. How do I want that person treating me? Well, I want him treating me respectfully and as I should be, as I just should be treated. Okay, then you treat people underneath you in that same fashion. And so when we're, again, when we're thinking about this in this context and its illustration that's being laid out, here is the one coming in and he actually has ownership. These are my sheep. And thus the reason for the care, the concern, the compassion, the wantingness to protect, to the farthest degree or furthest degree that he would be willing to lay down his own life. But there again that's another element that needs to be laid onto this, and that as we become Christians and we take on the name of Christ, we are commanded to become more like him. Well, if Jesus, as the Good Shepherd, and we're supposed to follow his example, is willing to lay down his life for the sheep, what are we then supposed to be willing to do as workers underneath over his flock?
John 15:14.
John 15:14. We should be willing to lay down our lives for the brethren.
Fifteen, 13. Excuse me.
And that, once again, we have Jesus laying out how that he is the standard of leadership. A person that will ask you or command you to do something that they are not willing to do themselves is not a good leader. Jesus commands that we be willing to lay down our lives for the brethren. Did Jesus do that? Yes. He set the example. Practice what he preached. During this time frame, you have the priests and the Levites. They had the duty and the responsibility of teaching the nation, and they should have stood up to oppose these other groups that came in. Okay, here are wolves coming in, Pharisees, Sadducees. And they're wanting to bring in their own traditions, their own commandments. Why didn't the Levites stand up and say, no? That's the other heavy position about leadership. Sometimes you just get tired of being the one who has to stand up and do something all the time. And that is just, well, let them come in. Let them come in. Let them run amok. Let them destroy. They didn't uphold their responsibility. They stepped away from their responsibility. And thus you have what you have during this time frame with the Jewish system. But then, inside of this, we have once more Jesus foretelling of his death. He's already pointed out the fact, John chapter 5, John chapter 8, he already knows that they have a plan to go and kill him. And even in this chapter, once we get down to verse 30, 30 and 31, where Jesus again claims himself being with deity and stating, I and the Father are one. The very next verse, they're wanting to take up stones so as to kill him. Jesus knows all of this is going on. And he knows of their desires and he knows of their plans. And he lays it out before everybody. Yeah, this is going to happen. But just because it's going to happen, do not think for one moment that it's happening just simply because you want it. I'm well aware of what your intentions are, but all of this is laying out and fitting into the actual plan and the actual will of God. And just to further illustrate this hireling problem, and it's not just a Levite and priest problem, though if you have problems in this area of those who are supposed to be mediating God's law, if you have corruption in this office, then you're going to have corruption everywhere else. And that Jesus gives a really good illustration of the state of the priesthood and the tribe of Levi when he gave the parable about the Good Samaritan. That in Luke 10, 30 through 32, when questioned about, well, who is my neighbor? Jesus answering said, a certain man went down from Jerusalem to Jericho and fell among thieves, which stripped him of his raiment, wounded him, departed, leaving him half dead. By chance there came down a certain priest that way, and when he saw him, he passed by on the other side. Likewise a Levite, when he was at that place, came and looked on him and passed by on the other side. They're only interested in themselves. But the tribe of Levi, and then specifically the priest, is an office and a work that is focused on the needs of others. And that's continuously. Everything that they're doing is in the service for the entire nation of Israel. But we have seen them during the time from which Jesus is here on earth, and how that they have in fact manipulated that to where now it's a system that just only feeds them. And that's a interesting thing to consider on how it is that God sets something up so as to have you be humbled all the time. So with the Levites, they did not have any land granted to them. They were a tribe, but they did not get any sections like Judah or Benjamin or Manasseh or Dan or anything like that. And the reason why was so that they would be reminded on the fact that God was taking care of them. But you just put yourself in that situation. Couldn't you see the temptation of getting tired of not actually owning anything? Yeah. I mean, here you are, and you've got nothing to call your own while everybody else is out here. They've got land, they've got houses, all these different possessions. And just, well, okay, here's what God has placed me in so as to help me. And that just becomes a burden. And I can see that happening with the tribe of Levi. Here we are going all of this time not having anything of our own. You know what? I think it's time for us to have something of our own. And what they took was the ultimate symbol of what belonged to God. And that being the temple and his house. So this once again presents to us the danger and the warning that's being stated for all generations, and raising the question of who are we listening to? Just because someone calls himself brother does not mean that that automatically puts him in a position that he needs to be listened to. Because here are brethren in Israel. And Jesus calls them thieves and robbers who steal, kill, and destroy.
I just want to add on that example came to me specifically this past fall. You know, with brethren in Mount Zion, you expected to lead as they were supposed to, and they failed. They're human. But it just goes to show you, you can't just give them the title without them actually doing the work of being a leader. And
Louder.
I was disappointed in Mount Zion last fall because of what happened.
okay.
There's a microphone right here. I'm trying not to
Do we
blow
just need to
it
get her
out.
another big chair over here beside me?
And I don't.
Interpret, yeah. But then, so then, it really does lay out how that there's nobody that is above scrutiny. And that when so we've already brought it up when we consider that point, Jesus himself going out, teaching, preaching, and having questions raised to him and everything like that. He doesn't run away from the questions or try to beat back anybody from asking the questions. And so even in this very chapter, when we get to verse, after verse 19, there's a division. And then verse 23 or 24, then came the Jews round about him and said unto him, How long dost thou make us doubt? If thou be the Christ, tell us plainly. So here they are continuing to ask and try to figure out, okay, what's happening here? Jesus doesn't bite and snap back at them. Who are you to question me? He explains further. And so if this is how the Good Shepherd behaves, then what about us who are underneath that? Okay, got something to ask about me? Ask it. And I don't need to see it as you trying to question my authority. What authority do I really have outside of what's been given to me? Nothing. So that's looking at things on the inside. And then, of course, there's the application for the man-made churches that we have around us. Those are flocks that Jesus never built, folds that he never put together. And they're out there and they're teaching their own ideas and leading sheep into the ditch. And all of this is being established upon the principle of the sheep that hear the voice of the shepherd. And then we add on an extra point of that about hearing the voice of the shepherd, and that being what we have written down for us here in the Bible. And then what the devil has done to have men come along and try to change the voice by bringing in all these different versions. ESV, NIV, the Living Word translation, whatever. That's not really a translation, it's another version. But then you just tack on the fact that, well, so in Virginia, I was going to a denominational Bible study, and they were going through some of the Old Testament prophets, and everybody in the room, which I will grant to them, that's one of the few Bible studies that I've gone to where everybody had a Bible. But the problem is that the teacher in the class was teaching from a different version, and then the 10 or so people sitting around the table, they all had different versions. And they all 10 of them said different things. Well, how are we supposed to know what to listen to if we can't get honed in and fasten down the voice we're supposed to listen to? And that's a dangerous element that's been brought into this, and a lot of our brethren are feeding into it. There are a lot of brethren that are using a lot of these bad versions. That's altering the voice from what we actually know and understand to be tacked to and aligned with the words that are being used in the first century.
How do we know what version is good? Because even the version that you use, they have the word hell and the word world. When it's the word age.
Mm-hmm.
You know how they're interswitched.
Yeah.
How are we supposed to know which one's good? How do we know that?
Because the King James is attached to certain Greek texts. So that even though, yes, the English, and that's just one of the problems that you're going to have with translation, moving from one language to another, Spanish to English and things like that. But the fact that I can take this English word and that it is attached to a Greek word, and in knowing what that Greek word is, I'm able to get the meaning. Now, so as we've discussed in our broadcast, for example, like Acts chapter 12 and the use of the word Easter, yeah, the translator shouldn't have put the word Easter. But that still doesn't do any damage to the King James because of it being connected to the Greek. And that word simply is Pascha. Okay, that's Passover. The problem with the ESV, NIV, and these different versions is that in their preface or preface, however you pronounce it, they admit that they do not hold to a word-for-word translation like the King James does, but that they go for a thought translation as to what do they think this is actually meaning. And so they tell you from the outset that they are inserting their own concepts and their own ideas into the text. So things that used to simply be in the footnotes, these different versions have now brought into the text itself. And without any real regards to any historical Greek language attachment, manuscript attachment, is one of the major problems.
I see that from like you and me and all of us that have been studying the Bible for so long, and we know these things. And I'm talking like the layman, the person that's kind of new coming into this, and they might have a different version, and sometimes they might hear you reading from your King James, unless you tell them that the word world is actually meaning age, they wouldn't understand that. And then we'd have to explain to them how and why, the word is actually not supposed to be world, but it's supposed to be age. But I'm just thinking about all the people that are out there with their different versions and how we can help them to understand that these aren't they'd have to be willing to study.
And that is an in-depth study, and it is a very dry study. And unless you have an interest in it, more than likely you're not going to dig into it. But yeah, I mean, it is one of those things that and so not only do you have the Greek manuscripts, but even with the Dead Sea Scrolls that were found in the jars in the cave, those are some of the oldest Hebrew copies of the Old Testament. And that when they translated those over into English. And when they aligned those translations, that translation of the Old Testament to the King James Version of the Old Testament, it aligned in every single way except for a few points of punctuation. And that's the kind of stuff that grounds this to what we actually have in history. To it being the, like, not even just the point of the closest, but the words that are supposed to be there. And so then when it comes into like the introduction of all these different voices, or these different versions, it's just, I mean, it's the devil up to his same old tricks. All he had to do was to change just a little bit of what God said to get over on Eve. And that's the same trick that's being played today. Let's just start changing around certain things. And then also when you start considering some of the committees that put together these different versions, you can see that they bring their own doctrinal bent or direction into the text. Now, granted, with the King James translators, many of them, I'm sure, had some of their own false ideas, but they were able to set those things to the side and just simply look at the text and translate it as it is. And another way to be able to view that being seen is with A.T. Robertson that I've used earlier in our John studies to look at certain words. Okay, when it comes to him dealing with the text and what words actually mean and what they say, he is spot on. One of the best. But then when it comes time to him sticking with that, he can't do it. And one of the best examples is Acts 2:38 with the word ace. He knows, and he says it in his book, this word is not used as because of or something that's already happened. It's always being used to point forward to something that's going to be received. But guess what he does when it comes time to give explanation for the remission of sins? He explains it away. Can't do it. Just can't bring himself to hold to what the text says.
What name did you mention right there?
A.T. Robertson.
A.T.?
Yep. No. I don't know. Never looked into it.
Those writings were in the 1800s. Were they the ones who received that?
I believe so, yeah. Yeah.
He's your great-great-great-granddaddy.
One of the best Greek scholars, and he's a member of the Baptist Church. So yeah, I mean which at some point we will need to go through a study of it, the manuscripts, how those different things were done, and yeah, I would say that would be a really good one to try to invite people to whenever we set it down to try to do it. And I'll do my best to present it in a way to be able to hold people, but it ultimately comes back to, well, do you really want to know this, or you just want to go along? But so yeah, good question, and just in a short encapsulated format would be some of the things that I try to point out to people to try to help them to recognize. Yeah, and just the fact that we wouldn't be here today. Like, we wouldn't be where we are today without the King James Version. And it's like people should really question that point and that factor. I was like, well, if the King James Version was able to bring us this far,
Thus far.
why? Yeah, then why would we need to alter it? Why would we need to turn from it? And all the stuff they say about outdated, archaic language and whatever, it's just that's not the real reason. So, but there again, that's a good question to lead us into the next point of this about, and that's where we are today, and that's really a lot of what this debate that I'm having with David hinges on about, well, how do I really know the voice? How do I really know about what's being said and if it's true or not? All of this discussion that Jesus is having with this crowd is pointing to the direction of you can know, and know so confidently and so definitively that it's without question. And we don't need to be afraid of that. And so that's one of his true or false questions to me, and I can't remember exactly how it's worded, but it ultimately comes down to the degree of, do you know everything that you need to know? Yes, I do. And I have no qualms of trying to state that. And if we're not going to come to that position, then we shouldn't be in a position of trying to direct people and lead people to us being the one true church. Because how do you know? If you don't stand firm and stand confident on what's being taught, and that this is, in fact, the truth and the voice, then we're just leaving all of this up to everybody's interpretation. And there's really no way to know the voice of the shepherd. And this issue of, well, how can we really be sure? Jesus is telling us here that we can. You can know the voice of the shepherd. You can know the voice of these others. It's not lining up. And anyone like David trying to make an argument like that, they're only trying to do it because they have some position that they know they cannot back up. They can't back it up, but they won't let it go. And so they're trying to find another way so as to excuse a false position. I mean, he practically said it in the interview and then throughout his debate. The very reason of why he's not looking into the subject matter of women preachers. There's no reason for you not to look into that, considering that you're at a place that has a woman preacher and you don't know if it's right or not.
But if you can worship other gods and still be in with God, then you can be with a woman preacher in the church.
Yeah.
Seclutively.
And it's just like, no. When you take in, not even just the 1 Timothy 2 and the 1 Corinthians 14, but in laying out 1 Timothy chapter 3, and that if we take his use of the word pastor as being a preacher, okay, that role is specifically for men. That is not difficult to understand. But all he can lean back on is, well, how are you sure? Why are you not sure? Why wouldn't you want to make yourself sure? Well, because that allows me to then not have to really worry about stuff. Yes?
That was in a discussion that we were having with that lady yesterday, is it finally came down to, we brought up the point you have to believe, repent, and be baptized, and she says, no, all you have to do is believe, and then she brought up the fact that, what about babies? What if they die? They weren't baptized, they didn't believe, they didn't this and that. So are they damned to hell? We said no. So she was trying to go see, and I asked her, so you're hinging so hard on belief, I'm going to ask you the same thing. What's your standpoint? Well, I'm not the judge, so
Right.
I don't know. I can't tell you.
While you're
whether or
telling us
not.
that we're wrong.
Yeah, I can't tell you. And that's what she wanted to hold on to was, well, I'm not the judge, and then she ended up walking away, stewing away.
And that just shows no foundation.
Mm-hmm.
The very thing that Paul wrote about, that we're not supposed to be like children, tossed to and fro, well, that's based upon you knowing something. Well, then we better get to know him. And let's see, we were there 13, so we'll deal with this. And this will be where we end up having to stop. Verse 14, I'm the good shepherd, know my sheep, and am known of mine. All of these, once again, are truth statements. I know them. They know me. How do you know? Can we really know? Obviously we can, because Jesus is using these terms. As the Father knoweth me, even so know I the Father. And this is an important point that Jesus is laying out by establishing for us and showing for us, well, how is it that you're known of the Father? And I lay down my life for the sheep. He is living his life in accordance to the will of the Father. Once again, showing to us and to others that this is more than just a mental assent. This is more than just a mental acknowledgement of, oh, well, I believe God. That doesn't mean that God knows you just because you say that. The Father knows me, even as I know the Father. I lay down my life for the sheep. That's how God recognizes who are his and who are not. If you hear the voice of the shepherd, what are you going to do?
Obey.
You're going to obey. You're going to follow. You're going to do what he says. But twice in this, he states this qualifying factor, I lay down my life for the sheep. Verse 16, other sheep I have which are not of this fold, them also I must bring, and they shall hear my voice. There shall be one fold and one shepherd. So this is another good point to the question that Adrian brought up about, well, words being used and then being translated.
I would say, obviously, this is the American Indians.
Right.
That's what the Mormons say.
Yeah. But even when we're thinking about John 10 and verse 16, we need to take a moment and bring some clarification about this verse in connection with the use of the word fold. Now, it's not a situation that, oh, this is doing some, great damage to the text. But it is a situation of, if you're not doing your word studies, then you're possibly going to miss a point. When we look at John 10:16, and I have this in presenter mode, so I can't see exactly what it is that you're reading. Other sheep I have, which are not of this fold. Okay, do you see that Greek word on there? Them also I must bring, and they shall hear my voice, and there shall be one fold. Do you see that Greek word? Is it the same word? The difference in these words is that this first word carries with the idea of, yes, this is a fold. So a fold is the place of protection. It is that wall that's being built up where you're needing to be so as to gain entrance, exit, pasture, and your provisions and your safety and your protection. This word, fold, in other passages is translated flock. And I think the American Standard Version translates it that way. Does it? Okay.
Yes.
Now, it's not that too major of a point, because when you're thinking about, well, okay, there's going to be one fold, okay, the flock goes into the fold. So there is that understanding there. But when we're thinking about it from this standpoint of, okay, and in the context of what Jesus is discussing here, other sheep I have which are not of this fold. What's that?
The Gentiles.
This is Israel.
Oh.
Right. As he's been laying out this illustration, and I think it was the last class period, I even had a picture of it that we were trying to picture what Jesus is doing here of calling his sheep. He is calling them out of the fold of Israel. They went to the Jews first. These are the lost sheep of Israel we're trying to call. It's not a nationalistic call. It is an individual call. But he's calling that remnant that's talked about in the Old Testament, that small group that's going to be studying their scriptures, knowing their scriptures, looking for this, and that when they hear the shepherd call, they're going to leave that fold of Israel to come into his fold. But then when we get to the bottom part, them also I must bring, and they shall hear my voice, and there shall be one flock and one shepherd. What is the importance and what's the significance of the distinction to make there? That when we're thinking about these two words, and that, okay, here's the fold, but then we talk about the flock.
Well, like was earlier was said, in the denominational sense, people might be able to take it as all of these many divisions can come into one.
Yeah.
But Jesus is meaning it otherwise. So he's pulling the Jews to become Christians, and then the Gentiles will eventually become Christians also.
Okay. So while the fold is a set place that you're needing to be in, the actual flock itself and the sheep are not Jews only. Other sheep I'm bringing into this flock. There are groups that are going to make up the sheep that are not going to be from this fold. And you have that picture being laid out, Acts chapter 2 on the day of Pentecost. People from all these different nations and even strangers from Rome that were there. They heard the gospel and they believed and obeyed it. Acts 8, you have the Samaritans. Philip goes and preaches to them. They believe and they're baptized. Here are these different sheep that are being brought in to the flock. Acts 10, Cornelius and his household. The first Gentile, uncircumcised convert being brought in. Here are all these different species of sheep, if you will. And that's how a lot of your ranching is done. You might have a set fold. Again, I think to Pablo and his family, because they're really the only ones I've had any close interaction with their livestock. Okay, they have a ranch, they have a farm, and they have a fold. But once you start investigating the flock, guess what you find?
Different sheep.
Okay, they're all sheep, but you have different breeds of sheep that are being brought in there. And I know firsthand because I had to go help them pick up that French
Ram?
one, yeah, French ram, thank you, to come into the flock and so as to breed. And so it's just those little elements that, okay, yeah, that's not too lost with the word fold, because even before we went into a breakdown of the words, everybody was already picking up on what's being understood here. That, yeah, everybody recognizes this, and that, well, okay, we have different sheep that are being brought into the fold. But if we're attaching the words with how they're actually being used, then to some degree the significance can be lost. And but as I said, in dealing with language and dealing with translation, that's something that happens all the time. You look at French words and Spanish words, and they end up getting translated over into English. And it's like, well, this is kind of close to what we have in our dialect to comprehend or to get what they have. But it's still not the same thing. And even with our English language going from the Greek and everything like that, we've had to make up words. Baptizo, for example. We didn't have an English word for that, so they created one. Would have been better if they just left it immersion than to create a word. But then even looking at, one of the best studies to illustrate that, we have one word for love. But then you break it down in the Greek, and they have all these different words so as to illustrate, well, no, this, here's this kind of love, and then there's this kind of love, and this kind of love. And to a large degree, our English is very lazy. Americans. And that we have this idea being further illustrated, pictured with Paul when he writes to the Ephesians. Okay, here's the church, this one body, but who do we have coming into this church, this one church and this one body? Ephesians 2 and verse 11, wherefore remember that ye being in time past Gentiles in the flesh, who are called uncircumcision by that which is called the circumcision in the flesh made by hands. So here's this separation between Jew and Gentile. That at that time ye were without Christ, being aliens from the commonwealth of Israel, strangers from the covenants of promise, having no hope, and without God in the world. And then here's the contrast. But now, in Christ Jesus, ye who sometimes were far off, are made nigh by the blood of Christ. For he is our peace, who hath made both one, and hath broken down the middle wall of partition between us, having abolished in his flesh the enmity, even the law of commandments contained in ordinances, for to making himself of twain one new man, so making peace, and that he might reconcile both unto God in one body by the cross, having slain the enmity thereby. All right. Here you have all these different kinds of sheep coming in to make the flock inside of the fold. There's the one sheepfold, the one church, the one body that you're needing to be in. Well, who's in it? Well, let's start looking at the flock. What's the flock made up of? Jews, Gentiles. Everybody is being brought into this. And we know that's a crucial point when we're talking about the Jews, because they thought they were the only ones. We're the only ones that God cares about. We're the only ones that are special in His eyes. Nobody else is getting in here. Yeah, you are special. He does care about you. But He never designed this to be just for you guys only. And we mentioned it before, we can find ourselves in that same type of danger. That here we are, as the Church of Christ, the Church of God, His chosen people, obeyed the gospel, cleansed by His blood, in the family of God, in the fold of God. And then we just start looking at this as being something that, well, this is for us and nobody else. But that's not the way this is to operate. We are supposed to be going out and making more disciples, bringing more sheep in to enjoy what we have. Israel lost sight of that. And a lot of our brethren have lost sight of that too. And then if they do have a desire to bring people in, they don't have them coming in the right way. And so to kind of wind this down, even though it is in an odd place, all of this is pointing back to Christ, His authority, and then the dictations and the qualifications that He's placing on those that are going to follow Him. And that ultimately this all comes back to character. Why won't the Pharisees follow? Why were they not a part of the flock? Why were they not in the fold? They thought they had something better already. And so they wouldn't listen. Why is it that others are willing to listen and are willing to follow? Comes back to that character. They are viewing the system that God has given to them, and everything inside of that Old Testament system was pointing them to the reality of how much they needed God. And that's the same thing that's being taught to us. Why are we Christians? Why are we members of the church? Because we're so good? And that we don't have any need of anything? No. The very fact that we're here is because we hopefully realize, no, there is something that I need. And that the Christ is the only one to provide what it is that I need. And so I follow. And then it's getting others around us to be able to feel that same inadequacy, and that's the hard part. Because nobody wants to feel as though they are inadequate or that they are dependent upon somebody else. And that's the position of the Pharisees. They were in charge. They were in leadership. In their minds, they were at the top. And they had forgotten or just simply are ignoring these basic elements. And that kind of stuff is still happening today. So any other thoughts? Questions?